Next, let me introduce Kelsey. You've heard so much about her already. She works for California Cities, Orange County.
I really don't need a microphone because I'm not loud, but I'll go ahead and give it a shot. Are we still awake? We're still good? It's a lot of information to digest all at once. I'm actually going to do this. This will make my life easier. Okay, so my name's Kelsey. I am the Policy and Legislative Affairs Director for the Association of California Cities, Orange County. Really long name, so I just call it the Association. What that means is I work with the 34 cities in Orange County on a variety of policy and legislative issues ranging from infrastructure and technology to economic development, and most recently now, homelessness. So the way we got involved with homelessness here in Orange County is a somewhat interesting story, and there's two people I'm going to embarrass while I tell this story, Bex and Dr. Snow. So Bex works for United Way, and then Helen's here from Jamboree, and then Dr. Snow works for UCI, and they all got together and decided to ask a very simple question. How much does homelessness cost Orange County every single year? And through their efforts, they were able to actually quantify what that cost was, be it through public safety, through emergency room costs, and other areas. And that number really was a rallying cry for the entire county, because we found out that in fiscal year 2014-2015, that we'd spent almost $300 million as a community. And during that same time, our homelessness population increased. So we were spending a lot of money to have the problem continue to get worse. So that really motivated our organization, because we found out that the group that was spending the most amount of money on the issues were actually cities. They were the ones that were bearing the cost of homelessness in our communities. There was also a key recommendation that came out of the cost of homelessness study that recommended the building of permanent supportive housing. Do we all remember what Julia just told us was permanent supportive housing? We're all paying attention? Yes. All right, so I then asked the question, along with a group of very, very talented people, so how much of it do we need? What, do we just keep building, and then eventually Julia will be like, that's enough, you're good, that's all. So it's not a perfect number, because as you know, counting our homelessness population is always a struggle. I was actually down the street during the 2016 point in time count, counting this specific area of Newport. And I lived in Fullerton and then lived in Irvine most recently, and I silly thought that Newport didn't have any homeless, and we found 9 people, so I was very confused. But it goes to show that this really is a county-wide problem. So the number that our group came up with was 2,700 units. That's how many units of permanent supportive housing we thought we needed to address the most pressing need of our chronically homeless individuals. So because I work for cities, they all said, Kelsey, that's really great, but how am I going to pay for it? And that was a very good question. So we began thinking about, with the loss of redevelopment, cities had much less flexible dollars with rising pension costs. So much of their general fund was already being dedicated to specific areas. And there was money that was coming down from the state level, but historically Orange County has not done well in those state processes. Does anybody remember the last time there was a housing bond type like Prop 1 on the ballot? Okay, I'm younger and I remember. So it was in 2006 was the last time we had one. And do you want to know how much money we brought back to the County of Orange in 2006? Any guesses? No, we did a little better than that. But it was a $4 billion bond. Any guesses on how much we brought back? $10 million out of $4 billion. That is awful. And one of the reasons that continuously happens here in Orange County is because we have 34 very unique and very different cities, and we sometimes struggle to work well together. So 34 cities are all going up to Sacramento asking for the same exact money. They're not coordinating together. And so 1 or 2 projects that are super deserving and should get that money due, but everybody else gets kind of left behind. And we thought that sounded like an inefficient way to try to address this issue. So as we were thinking about how we finance and how we collaborate this county, we came up with the idea that eventually turned into AB 448. So I am also a lobbyist, so don't throw things at me, I'm a good one. And so my job was to help move AB 448 through its legislative process. So I want to talk a little bit about what that process was and what it does. So AB 448 is known as the Orange County Housing Trust. What it does is it's meant to act as a financial kind of collaborator and kind of governing point to help finance the creation of permanent supportive housing. But in addition to permanent supportive housing, what the county had found when they worked with us on the 2,700 unit plan is that we have this huge gap in terms of very low, extremely low, and low income housing. And we call those folks that deal with that as our on the bubble folks, that when there's the next recession or we lose our jobs, those folks are most likely to fall into homelessness. So it's really important that we kind of shore up that group as well. So we went ahead and put that in the bill too, and said we can help finance the funding and construction of extremely low, very low, and low income housing. It also had the ability to receive public and private dollars, and I want to pause here just for a moment because it's really critical. So public dollars are the dollars that we'd be able to go after, like Prop 1 or SB2, which Julia talked about. But it also is set up to be it can be a direct recipient of state funding. So Julia also mentioned HEAP, and that was a direct, what we call a direct budget allocation. The state wrote it into the budget and said, this is what we're gonna do. So in theory, the Orange County Housing Trust and maybe the other trusts that exist throughout the state of California could be the recipient of a direct state infusion of dollars. So we wanted to set it up to do that, and that's part of the reason we needed the legislation. But the other piece of it was, in the last year, we've seen a huge rallying of the private sector on this issue, and it's been massively transformative on the topic. And so what we've been hearing from our friends in the philanthropic communities and in the business communities is, I want to help, but I don't know how, and I don't like the idea of throwing a little money at this project and a little money at this project because it doesn't feel like I know what's going to get done. And so we created this entity to be able to be that coordinating body that can say, if you give your philanthropic dollars here, you know that the end product will be 2,700 units of permanent supportive housing. Okay, I'm gonna keep going. Oh, the other thing, if you're a techie person like me, is that all of the housing that's developed by the Orange County Housing Trust is likely to be counted towards cities' RHNA numbers. That's the Regional Housing Needs Assessment numbers. That's a really big selling point for our cities. So if you ever show up to your cities and encourage them to do things, remind them, like, if you build this housing, you will get some numbers knocked off of your RHNA, and that will make them happy. So just as I talk about what it can do, I think it's equally important to tell you what it can't do. So one, it's not a regulator of land use. We will not be able to go into a city and say, City X, you are going to build 40 units of permanent supportive housing on this street and this street, because that would make our cities very upset. So we put them in the law that we couldn't do that. The other piece is that it will not be an owner or operator of the units. Historically, public housing has been less than stellar. And I know a lot of times when I have gone to council meetings, the public, because they don't understand what permanent supportive housing is or how beautiful we make it look now, are worried that it's going to look like the quote projects. And so we have really, really great nonprofit permanent supportive housing, low income and workforce housing developers here in the County of Orange, and we wanted to help them do their job, and by giving them money to go do more of it. And so that's why we wrote into the law that the housing trust wouldn't be an owner or operator. It has no power of eminent domain. It wasn't enough for me to just say we didn't have land use authority. I also had to say that we couldn't claim eminent domain, so we put that in there too. It does not act as a substitute for local control. That again goes back to that land use issue. So what this would look like is your cities would come to the housing trust with their nonprofit developer and say, we want to do 60 units of permanent supportive housing and we have a financial gap of $3 million. Can you help us fund it? It would not be the opposite of that, which would be the housing trust going to the city and saying, here's $3 million, go work with this developer to do this. It's the opposite kind of way. And then, very important here, it does not have the ability to impose taxes or fees, which is A very important point. So I kind of talked about this already. Oh, we also had bipartisan support on the bill. So our joint authors were Assemblymember Daley and Assemblywoman Sharon Quirk Silva. But we also got bipartisan support from Senator Bates, Nguyen, and Morlock, who represents all of you if you're here in the area of Newport. And so those of you who know John know that he is a huge fiscal responsibility guy, which I greatly appreciate. And so we worked with his office to put in some strong auditing and financial reporting mechanisms, because the last thing we want to have happen is this trust gets set up, it has a lot of money to operate, and then all of you don't know what those dollars went to. We want it to be transparent. So this is a little bit of what Julia was talking about the different funding that kind of already exists in the system. So we have these things called low-income tax credit. There's both 4% and 9%. We have Mental Health Service Act Special Housing Needs Program. SB2, which she was talking about, is up in the corner. So any given, there's about 10 different sources. So I do want to pause here, because for our friends in the nonprofit development world, this probably looks really confusing for all of you, and this is what they deal with all the time. This is how they make projects come to life, is by combining 5, 6, 7 different sources of revenue to get these projects to creation. So imagine going through this process, getting your No Place Like Home dollars, getting your 4% tax credit, getting some SB2 dollars, and you feel like you're right there. You've done all this work, you've filled out all the applications, you've gone to all the hearings, and now you are $1.5 million short on a $20 million project. Sounds kind of crazy, except it's not. It happened in Santa Ana this year. And it was a housing project for chronically homeless veterans. And that project sat there for years because they could not fill a $1.5 million gap. They had everything else figured out, but they could not figure that piece out. So that's where the Housing Trust comes in, is it comes in to fill those gaps and get those projects going. Because after you've done all this work, that little amount of money shouldn't be what keeps you from housing chronically homeless individuals. The other piece is SB3, now known as Prop 1. This is some of the breakdown of what those dollars look like and where they go in those programs. I want to point out, I guess it looks yellow. It's right next to the gray one. The Self-Help Housing Fund. It has $150 million in it. So by creating an Orange County Housing Trust, we are now uniquely available for that pot of money, because we will have created a housing trust that can go after those dollars. And that's where those philanthropic dollars are going to be so critical, because they're matching. So if we waste $20 million in private money, we can ask the state to match us for $20 million extra. So very, very powerful. So what's next? I guess I should tell you, the bill passed, the governor signed it, yay, we're all very happy. It was a great experience. The next part that we kind of have to figure out is how this thing is actually going to operate, because the JPA language, we like to think of it as kind of like a boat, and now I have to fill in all of the planks of the boat to actually make it float. Hey, that rhymed, that was good. So what we have to figure out is, one, governance. We have to figure out who's going to sit on this trust, who's going to have the decision making. The only thing that the legislation tells us is that it has to be elected officials. And the reason for that is because the majority of the funding that they are going to be overseeing and pushing out will be taxpayer dollars. And so according to state law, only elected officials can decide what is done with taxpayer dollars. That's not to say that there can't be an advisory committee that's made up of people that advise the governing board on how they should spend money. But what we're at the process of doing right now is working with the County of Orange to develop a working group that decides what that governance structure looks like, who sits on it, what are the values, the vision, the priorities for that group. In addition, the meat of what has to happen next is the operational side of it. So luckily, AB 448 doesn't really say a whole lot about what it has to do. So we kind of get to make it up as we go and figure out what works best for Orange County. So what this operational working group will look like is not only that values group, but we're also going to bring in the nonprofit developers and the service providers, because they really are the experts that can tell us what happens if we fund a project at the beginning, the middle of the process, or at the end, and why it's necessary to kind of have those different mechanisms. This operational working group will also most likely address how we're going to prioritize projects. Do we prioritize them based on region? Do we prioritize them based on the populations that they're serving, veterans versus chronically homeless single men? And then, again, the funding points that I mentioned, the beginning, middle, or end of projects. And then, what does the flow of funding look like? Is this an over-the-counter process? Do you put out an RFP at the beginning of every quarter and say, we have X amount of dollars available, come get it? So lots of really important pieces. So before I turn the mic back over, what I will say, because all of you are citizens and hopefully voters, and this process is going to be very complicated, and it is going to be somewhat difficult. As I mentioned before, we have 34 cities, which means that as we write this operational guidelines for the Housing Trust, we have to try to keep 34 cities happy. I've been doing this job for 3 years, it's very difficult. So what I would say, where all of you come in, is as we come up with those guidelines and those operations, one of the best things that you can do is when we ask your cities to join, is to come and say, I want my city to be a part of this because I care about housing homeless people. And this is a very Orange County specific way that doesn't increase my taxes and allows us to allow public-private partnerships to get the job done. So with that, I will stop talking and turn it back over to Pastor Mark.